Welcome to the debate. Today, we are taking a magnifying glass to a really fundamental question pulled straight from some highly contested recent scientific literature. Is a calorie deficit the only factor in weight management?
Yeah, it's a massive point of tension right now in the academic sphere.
Exactly. On one side, we have the traditional energy balance model, which popular culture usually just shrinks down to that phrase, calories in, calories out. And on the other side,
On the other side, we have the carbohydrate insulin model standing alongside this absolute explosion of new research on our metabolisms, our genetics, and even the bacteria in our guts.
right? And I'll be representing the perspective that a calorie deficit is the fundamental thermodynamic gatekeeper here. It is the proximal mechanism for weight loss. I argue that every other biological factor we will discuss today ultimately does its work by altering either energy intake or energy expenditure.
And I take the opposing view. A strict, singular focus on a calorie deficit is just scientifically inadequate at this point. It ignores the regulatory root causes of obesity, things like hormonal substrate partitioning, which is really just a clinical way of saying how the body decides where to store the energy you eat. We also have to look at severe metabolic adaptation and the massive influence of the gut microbiome. Treating obesity purely as a mathematical energy balance issue fundamentally mischaracterizes what is actually happening in the human body.
To frame my position clearly right out of the gate, we have to ground our understanding in the first law of thermodynamics. That law simply cannot be bypassed by any biological organism. Weight change is ultimately governed by the energy balance equation. Now, I am not suggesting that biology is simple. Biology is extraordinarily complex. But I argue that biological variables, whether we are talking about hormones, stress levels, or how well you slept last night, they simply alter the variables within that thermodynamic equation. They do not rewrite the laws of physics.
But treating those biological variables as mere footnotes to an equation entirely misses the clinical picture.
They aren't footnotes, they are the inputs. For instance, if we look at the recent literature on sleep deprivation, we see that it leads to increased opportunities to eat and it alters hunger hormones. The result is a caloric surplus of roughly 300 kilocalories per day. The poorest sleep is the behavioral trigger, yes, but the physical root cause of the resulting weight gain is still that 300 calorie surplus. When human beings consume fewer calories than they expend, mass reduction is a physical certainty. Therefore, the calorie deficit is the only non-negotiable factor.
I come at it from a completely different way. Claiming that obesity is caused by a positive energy balance is practically a tautology. It restates a principle of physics without explaining the biological mechanisms of fat storage. It is akin to saying a fever is caused by a positive heat balance. While technically true, it tells us absolutely nothing about the underlying infection causing the fever. This is where the carbohydrate insulin model, the CIM, provides a much more robust physiological framework.
By focusing on insulin as the primary driver.
Exactly. The CIM posits that the quality of calories fundamentally alters the body's internal hormonal environment. Let's use a specific example, right from the material. If you consume 500 calories of whole grain rice, which has a high fiber content and a low glycemic index, it promotes satiety. You feel full and it digests slowly. But if you consume 500 calories of white crystalline sugar, it causes a rapid blood glucose spike. This triggers a massive insulin response. Insulin is a potent anabolic hormone. It promotes lipogenesis, meaning it actively drives fat storage, and it spurs subsequent hunger by sequestering circulating fuels away from other tissues. Your cells literally think they are starving even though you just ate. The physiological responses of the body render the simplistic a calorie is a calorie paradigm entirely obsolete.
That is a very elegant narrative regarding lipogenesis, I'll give you that. But when we subject the carbohydrate insulin model to rigorous testing, it struggles to account for several glaring physiological realities. If we are going to debate the quality of calories and how different macronutrients bend the rules of the energy equation, we absolutely must talk about protein.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the energy balance equation holds up when we look at protein. Let me tell you why the macronutrient composition completely shatters the linear model.
We have to look at the thermic effect of food, or TEF. The energy balance equation assumes a relatively static calories out variable, but the physiological processing of different macronutrients requires vastly different amounts of energy. Protein requires 20 to 30% of its own energy simply to be digested, absorbed, and metabolized by the body. In stark contrast, dietary fats require only 0 to 5%.
Right, meaning the body works much harder just to break the protein down.
Exactly. Therefore, an individual consuming a high-protein diet has a clear, measurable metabolic advantage over someone consuming an isocaloric high-fat or high-carbohydrate diet. Isocaloric meaning the total calories ingested are perfectly identical. This proves unequivocally that not all calories affect the body equally. The biochemical pathway a calorie takes matters just as much as the caloric value itself.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the role of protein because it actually highlights a fundamental flaw in the carbohydrate insulin model. The CIM relies heavily on the premise that insulin is the primary driver of obesity, the so-called fat cell fertilizer. But protein also triggers a highly significant insulin release.
It does, but the physiological context of that release is completely different than with carbohydrates.
But the mechanism is the same. Like carbohydrates, proteins are broken down into amino acids, which require insulin to be absorbed into cells. If insulin were the sole driver of body fat accumulation, as the CIM suggests, then high-protein diets should cause massive fat accumulation. Yet the clinical data consistently shows that high-protein diets promote fat loss and preserve lean muscle mass. Furthermore, the thermic effect of food you just brought up doesn't invalidate the energy balance model at all.
How does it not? It literally proves you get a different net energy yield from the exact same gross caloric intake. The math changes based on the food.
Because it is perfectly accounted for within the model. The TEF simply modifies the energy outside of the thermodynamic equation. It increases energy expenditure. The mechanism of weight loss remains the calorie deficit, which is just slightly widened by the higher thermic effect of the protein. The equation still balances perfectly.
But treating the energy outside of the equation as something we can simply manipulate with a slight widening of the deficit ignores the body's aggressive physiological resistance to that very deficit. This brings us to metabolic adaptation, or the biological set point. The human body does not passively accept a calorie deficit. It fights it with profound neuroendocrine counter-regulatory responses.
You are referring to the body slowing down its metabolism as it loses weight.
Yes, but the sheer scale of that slowdown is what dismantles the simple math. We have to look at the 6-year follow-up data from the Biggest Loser study. It is a perfect, albeit extreme, clinical model of severe caloric restriction. Participants in that study lost an average of 58 kilograms.
Right, but that was during the active starvation phase. They were exercising for hours a day while severely undereating.
That is the most alarming part. Even 6 years later, long after the active weight loss phase ended. During the initial drop, their resting metabolic rate, their RMR, plummeted by over 600 kilocalories per day. But 6 years post-show, after most participants had regained a significant amount of the weight, their resting metabolisms remained roughly 700 kilocalories below their baseline. They never recovered.
Their metabolisms adapted to the new lower body mass.
No, the drop was far beyond what could be explained by the loss of body mass alone. This proves the body actively protects a biological set point. It downregulates energy expenditure, lowering core body temperature, reducing subconscious fidgeting, all to force a positive energy balance. Making a long-term clinical recommendation based on a simple calorie deficit is utterly futile if we do not first address the metabolic health and hormonal environment of the patient.
I certainly acknowledge the severity of adaptive thermogenesis, particularly in extreme, televised weight loss interventions like the one you referenced. But I draw a completely different conclusion from that data. We must look at why that metabolic slowing occurs. It is not an arbitrary defect. It is a highly conserved evolutionary survival mechanism. When an individual loses substantial metabolic mass, both fat and fat-free mass, and remains in a state of energy deficit, the body responds exactly as it should to prevent starvation.
By crashing the metabolism so the patient regains the weight?
By becoming more metabolically efficient. We see profound declines in circulating leptin, the satiety hormone produced by adipose tissue, and significant reductions in active thyroid hormones, specifically T3 and T4. This downregulates mitochondrial biogenesis and ATP turnover, which is just a fancy clinical way of saying the body's cellular power plants slow down their energy production. That naturally reduces energy expenditure. But we cannot confuse the body's defense mechanisms with the physical mechanism of weight loss itself.
If the defense mechanisms overpower the individual's ability to maintain the deficit, the distinction doesn't matter practically.
It matters mechanistically. The calorie deficit is still the undisputed physical mechanism of the mass reduction, even if the body's endocrine adaptations make that deficit progressively harder to maintain. The thermodynamic equation still rules. The variables have just shifted against the patient.
But when the variables shift so aggressively against the patient, the equation becomes practically useless as a standalone tool. We are dealing with unconscious biological drivers that dictate these variables. You cannot consciously math your way out of genetics and microbiology. Look at the gut microbiome, which acts almost as a secondary endocrine organ. Recent metagenomic research has identified 31 baseline stool features that directly correlate with weight loss success or failure.
The microbiome's role in digestion is fascinating, but how does it override the actual caloric intake?
Because individuals who are clinically resistant to weight loss often harbor gut bacteria that are incredibly efficient at breaking down complex, indigestible polysaccharides and starches. They ferment these fibers into simple, absorbable, short-chain fatty acids like acetate. This means these individuals are effectively extracting and absorbing more calories from the exact same plate of food than someone with a different microbial profile. Their caloric intake is practically higher than what is printed on the nutrition label.
So their bodies are literally mining extra calories out of the food.
Yes, but unconsciously. Combine that with the sleep data you briefly mentioned earlier. Laboratory studies show that sleep deprivation lowers leptin by roughly 15.5% and raises the hunger hormone ghrelin by 14.9%. This completely hijacks conscious appetite control. It is not a matter of a patient simply choosing to eat 300 more calories. Their biology is screaming at them to consume energy.
That is a fascinating mechanism. But let's look at where that mechanism actually plays out in the math. Everything you just detailed, the microbial extraction of calories, the hormonal drive to eat following sleep deprivation, these details entirely support the energy balance model. They do not contradict it. Let's look at the genetic component you alluded to, specifically the FTO gene variant RS9939609, which is one of the most heavily studied obesity predisposing genes.
Which heavily influences body mass index and eating behaviors.
Absolutely. Individuals who carry the high-risk AA genotype experience impaired central nervous system satiety processing. When researchers put these people in front of an ad libitum buffet, an all-you-can-eat scenario, fMRI scans show their brain's reward centers literally lighting up differently than someone without the gene. They are unconsciously driven to eat, and they predictably consume roughly 350 more kilocalories. Their biology is hijacking their willpower. But here is the critical distinction. The FTO genetics did not magically synthesize adipose tissue out of thin air.
No, but it made resisting the food nearly impossible.
Prehensid, but the genetics altered the neurobiology of appetite, which caused a behavioral action, eating more food, which resulted in a caloric surplus. The genetic predisposition only manifests physically through the thermodynamic equation. The same applies to the gut microbiome. If a specific microbial profile is highly efficient at harvesting energy from fiber, it is merely altering the calories absorbed variable of the equation. The thermodynamic equation remains the ultimate arbitrator of whether mass is gained or lost.
That is a highly reductive view of human physiology. It assumes that if we just force the arithmetic, the biology will obediently comply. But the biology dictates the arithmetic. When we look at the carbohydrate insulin model again, we see that the partitioning of substrates, where the energy goes after it is absorbed, is what drives the systemic behavior.
But substrate partitioning still requires energy to partition in the first place.
Yes, but the destination of that energy changes everything. When high insulin levels, driven by high glycemic diets, sequester circulating fatty acids and glucose into adipose tissue, the brain senses a state of cellular starvation.
The brain doesn't look at a calorie tracking app. It monitors circulating ATP and fuel availability. Because the energy is trapped in fat cells, the brain lowers the resting metabolic rate and increases ghrelin to prompt feeding. The overeating is a symptom of the fat storage, not the primary cause. This is why interventions that focus solely on establishing a calorie deficit without altering the macronutrient quality to suppress insulin have such abysmal long-term success rates.
I am fundamentally unconvinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores the wealth of controlled feeding studies that directly compare the carbohydrate insulin model against the energy balance model. When calories and protein are strictly equated in metabolic ward studies, variations in carbohydrate and fat ratios produce no clinically meaningful differences in body fat loss.
Those studies often look at short-term outcomes where adaptation hasn't fully set in.
But they prove the underlying mechanism. If insulin were the primary driver of fat storage, as the CIM posits, then the low carbohydrate groups in those wards should experience drastically accelerated fat loss due to lowered insulin levels. But the data shows that weight loss is almost entirely dictated by the magnitude of the calorie deficit. Yes, insulin is a storage hormone, but it requires a surplus of energy to actually store meaningful amounts of new adipose tissue. Furthermore, insulin spikes are transient. Over a 24-hour period, a calorie deficit ensures that the net state of the body is catabolic, meaning it must draw upon stored endogenous fat to meet its energy demands, irrespective of post-meal insulin fluctuations.
That assumes a highly controlled metabolic ward environment translates to free-living humans, which it rarely does. In a free-living environment, a diet that continuously spikes insulin and blood glucose leads to reactive hypoglycemia, crashing energy levels, and relentless cravings. Telling a patient to just maintain a 500-calorie deficit when their FTO genotype is screaming at them to eat is asking them to fight a biological tsunami with a spreadsheet. Furthermore, we must address the sheer inter-individual variability in these responses. The precision nutrition data shows us that people with varying levels of baseline insulin resistance respond completely differently to the exact same caloric deficit.
Because their resting metabolic rates vary.
Because their hormonal environments vary. An individual with severe metabolic syndrome and hyperinsulinemia will struggle immensely to mobilize stored free fatty acids, even when placed in a caloric deficit, because their cellular machinery is essentially locked in an anabolic state. To them, a calorie is absolutely not just a calorie. The hormonal milieu of their body dictates that they will experience severe lethargy and loss of lean muscle mass before they lose visceral fat, unless the quality of their diet is changed to lower that baseline insulin.
Preserving lean muscle mass and mitigating lethargy are absolutely critical clinical outcomes. That is why the energy balance model does not say eat whatever you want as long as you hit a number. It simply states that the deficit is the necessary condition for weight loss. We know that adequate protein intake alongside resistance training is vital during a caloric deficit to prevent the body from breaking down its own muscle mass for fuel. We also know that managing stress, which lowers cortisol, and optimizing sleep makes adherence to the deficit infinitely more manageable. But all of these sophisticated interventions are successful precisely because they allow the individual to comfortably sustain a negative energy balance. The biology determines the compliance, but the thermodynamics determine the mass reduction.
I think the danger in your perspective is that it places the burden of failure almost entirely on the individual's ability to maintain a mathematical deficit. We have to address the regulatory systems. If we optimize the gut microbiome through fiber-rich, unprocessed diets, we alter the production of short-chain fatty acids like propionate and butyrate. These metabolites cross the blood-brain barrier and directly stimulate the release of GLP-1 and PYY. Powerful natural satiety hormones. By fixing the ecology of the gut and the hormonal signaling, the energy intake naturally drops without the patient consciously having to restrict themselves. The deficit becomes an effortless byproduct of a healthy metabolic system rather than a forced mechanical imposition.
Optimizing the gut microbiome and leveraging natural satiety hormones is certainly the frontier of modern obesity treatment. But while we clearly fundamentally disagree on whether the thermodynamic equation or the hormonal environment sits at the top of the hierarchy, I will summarize my position by stating that I view this with a great deal of intellectual charity towards the biological complexities. I readily acknowledge that genetics, sleep architecture, thyroid function, and the microbiome heavily dictate how difficult it is for any given individual to establish and maintain an energy deficit. The playing field is not level. However, regardless of how much leptin drops or how efficient the gut bacteria are, the calorie deficit remains the proximal mechanism and the absolute thermodynamic gatekeeper required for mass reduction. You cannot lose weight in a caloric surplus no matter how perfectly optimized your hormones are.
And I will summarize my position by emphasizing that focusing exclusively on calories in, calories out is a demonstrably failed paradigm that has done little but generate stigma. Treating obesity purely as an energy balance problem is like treating a hemorrhage by constantly mopping the floor instead of repairing the artery. Precision nutrition, which meticulously accounts for hormonal responses, severe metabolic adaptation, and the unique metabolic profile of the gut microbiota, is absolutely necessary. We must move beyond the basic calorie deficit paradigm because human biology ultimately dictates the sustainability, the tissue composition, and the physiological impact of any energy imbalance. A calorie is not a biological constant.
While we remain at odds on the exact hierarchy of these mechanisms, I think we can both look at this data and agree that the old, reductive advice to simply eat less and move more is a relic of the past that proves grossly insufficient in practical settings.
On that, we are perfectly aligned. Prioritizing whole, unprocessed foods, managing circadian rhythms, and understanding a patient's individual metabolic and genetic profile are essential components for healthy weight management. The complexity of the human endocrine system demands nothing less than a holistic approach.
Indeed, the intersection of thermodynamics and endocrinology is a rich field, and there's clearly much more to be explored in the source material we've drawn from today. We will leave it up to you, our sophisticated listener, to form your own conclusions on the hierarchy of these biological and thermodynamic factors. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.